What if the 70s were not just about disco and rebellion, but also about movies so savage that governments tried to erase them from history? These were not mere films. They were confessions carved on celluloid, stories drenched in chaos. Today we dig into the shadows of cinema that went too far for comfort. Brace yourself for the 15 most brutal 70s exploitation movies that got banned. Number 15. The Last House on the Left, 1972. It began as a low-budget revenge thriller, but ended up rewriting the boundaries of screen violence. The Last House on the Left by Wes Craven was marketed with the chilling tagline that dared viewers to keep repeating to themselves that it was only a movie. Few could. The film tells of two teenage girls who fall victim to a pair of deranged criminals. What follows is a sequence of degradation and retribution that critics of the time called sickeningly realistic. When the girls' parents discover the truth, they deliver their own twisted justice. Craven was a newcomer inspired by European transgression films, and he wanted to shock American audiences out of their comfort zones. Censors around the world were not amused. The film was banned in Britain, Australia, and several European countries. Entire scenes were ordered to be cut, but bootleg versions continued to circulate in grindhouse theaters. Police even raided projection booths. In the United States, it faced intense backlash, with theaters pulling it after protests from moral groups. Behind the scenes, actors were reportedly traumatized by the scenes they filmed, and Craven later admitted he had gone too far, even for himself. Yet it was this excess that gave the movie its power. Decades later, The Last House on the Left was reappraised as a raw piece of 70s realism. It spoke to a country haunted by Vietnam and disillusioned by authority. Brutality became reflection. Shock became art. And Craven became a legend. Number 14. Cannibal Holocaust, 1979. No list of banned 70s exploitation films can exist without Cannibal Holocaust. Directed by Ruggero Deodato, this Italian production was both groundbreaking and infamous. It pretended to be a documentary shot by a film crew who vanished deep in the Amazon jungle. What the rescue team found was their footage documenting horrors beyond comprehension. The premise was simple, yet monstrous. Western filmmakers invade an indigenous tribe's lands to stage sensational footage. They exploit and abuse the locals to create fake brutality, but the tribe soon turns on them. The line between fiction and reality dissolves until the audience itself becomes complicit. Authorities thought it was real. When the film premiered in Italy, Deodato was arrested on suspicion of murder. He had to prove that his actors were alive by bringing them to court. Animal cruelty scenes were real and remain controversial to this day. The movie was banned in over 50 countries. In Britain, it was seized under the Obscene Publications Act. Behind the scenes, the crew endured unbearable jungle conditions. Actors suffered infections and breakdowns, yet Deodato insisted the message was about Western arrogance and the spectacle of violence itself. Critics were divided. Some called it depraved, others hailed it as a savage masterpiece. Cannibal Holocaust lives on as the most infamous exploitation film ever made. It predicted our obsession with found footage decades before Blair Witch and served as a grim mirror to media sensationalism. Brutality was not the goal. Exposure of hypocrisy was. Still, the images remain burned into the memory of anyone who dares to watch. Number 13. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. When a quiet writer named Jennifer retreats to a rural cabin seeking inspiration, she finds herself trapped in a nightmare that shocked the world. I Spit on Your Grave, directed by Mir Zarchi, became one of the most notorious films in cinema history. It was banned in multiple countries and condemned even by critics who supported artistic freedom. The story follows Jennifer's torment at the hands of a group of local men. But what began as cruelty turns into a story of vengeance. One by one, she hunts them down, turning the narrative of victimhood into one of empowerment through horror. Zarchi claimed he was inspired by a real assault he once witnessed. He wanted to portray the endurance of the human spirit, but audiences were unprepared. Censors around the world labeled it obscene. In the United Kingdom, it was banned outright for decades. Canada restricted it. Even in the United States, theaters refused to screen it. The advertising called it the most violent film ever made, and protesters agreed. Feminist groups debated whether it was exploitation or confrontation. Behind the camera, Zarchi worked with minimal crew and faced endless threats. Lead actress Camille Keaton delivered a performance of eerie silence that made the film unforgettable. Critics despised it at first, but underground audiences saw something different. Years later, I Spit on Your Grave became a cult symbol of revenge cinema. It forced viewers to confront their own comfort with violence and hypocrisy. It blurred the line between shock and justice. It remains one of the 70s most divisive creations, a film that dares to show how horror can both destroy and reclaim power. Number 12. Thriller, A Cruel Picture, 1973. In Sweden, this film was whispered about like a forbidden legend. Thriller, A Cruel Picture, directed by Bo Arne Vibenius, was sold as a revenge movie, but it was unlike anything the world had seen. It was banned nearly everywhere and became a secret icon of underground cinema. The story follows a young woman named Madeleine who is rendered mute after a childhood assault. As an adult, she is kidnapped and forced into a life of servitude. But instead of breaking, she trains herself in combat and returns to destroy those who wronged her. The camera captures each moment with icy precision, turning vengeance into ritual. Censors reacted with panic. Sweden banned it almost immediately. In the United States, it was re-edited and released under the title, They Call Her One Eye. Scenes were removed, but even the tamer version caused outrage. Critics condemned it, while cult audiences praised its feminist defiance. Behind the scenes, lead actress Christina Lindberg performed with stoic intensity. The production was small, cheap, and fast, but its aesthetic became iconic. The patch over her eye inspired future characters like Elle Driver in Kill Bill. Quentin Tarantino called it a cornerstone of revenge cinema. Thriller. A Cruel Picture was too cold, too methodical, too real. It challenged moral assumptions about who was allowed to fight back. Today it is preserved as a piece of exploitation history that turned horror into justice and brutality into cinematic art. Number 11. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Few films have been banned so widely yet admired so deeply as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Directed by Tobe Hooper, it was shot with a skeleton crew in the searing Texas heat on a budget that barely held together. What came out was a film that redefined terror. The story follows 5 friends who stumble upon a decaying farmhouse. Inside waits Leatherface and his family of cannibalistic outcasts. The camera barely shows the gore, yet audiences swore they saw everything. The power came from suggestion, from the sweat and panic dripping off every frame. When it hit theaters, governments around the world lost their minds. Britain banned it outright. Australia followed. Even in America, certain states refused to screen it. Newspapers warned that it would scar audiences forever. Yet the film contained almost no explicit violence. It was the atmosphere, the realism, the grinding sound of the chainsaw that drove people to faint in their seats. The cast suffered during filming. Temperatures reached over 100 degrees. Actors wore the same clothes for weeks as the stench of blood and meat filled the set. Gunnar Hansen, the man behind Leatherface, terrified even his co-stars. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre became a legend. It was banned for years, then resurrected by midnight screenings and cult fans. It proved that fear did not need special effects. It only needed truth. Beneath its madness lay a portrait of rural decay, the collapse of the American dream. Number 10. Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Paolo Pasolini's final film was more than controversial. It was a cinematic act of defiance that cost him his life. Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, took the writings of Marquis de Sade and placed them inside fascist Italy, turning human cruelty into political metaphor. The plot follows 4 corrupt officials who imprison a group of youths in a villa during wartime. There they enact perverse rituals of control and degradation. But Pasolini was not making exploitation. He was making accusation. He wanted to expose the sickness of power itself. Censors did not care. The film was banned across Italy, France, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Even critics who admired Pasolini were appalled. It was called evil, obscene, unwatchable. Police seized prints from theaters. Some countries held secret underground showings where audiences whispered as if witnessing forbidden truth. Behind the scenes, the young cast was traumatized. Pasolini guided them, gently explaining that the violence was symbolic, yet the imagery was so extreme that many viewers could not separate message from madness. Weeks after the film's completion, Pasolini was found murdered on a beach in Rome. Conspiracy theories still claim his death was tied to Salo. The movie itself became a curse. Today, Salo remains banned in several nations. Scholars call it one of the most important films ever made. It forces the audience to look at power, cruelty, and complicity. It is not horror, but mirror, a reflection of how civilization itself can devour the innocent while pretending to be moral. Number 9. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. Few films provoked more outrage than Ilra. She-Wolf of the SS. Directed by Don Edmonds and starring Diane Thorne, this Canadian-American production pushed the limits of exploitation cinema and was instantly banned in several countries. It blurred the line between horror fantasy and historical blasphemy. The story centers on Ilsa, the ruthless commandant of a Nazi prison camp who performs medical experiments on prisoners. Shot on leftover sets from Hogan's Heroes, the film was cheap, brutal, and relentless. It was marketed as revenge against cruelty, yet its shocking images made audiences recoil. Censors in Canada, Germany, Australia, and the United Kingdom swiftly outlawed it. The film was branded obscene and immoral. Even drive-in theaters that specialized in exploitation refused to show it. Critics called it unforgivable trash, but underground audiences turned it into a cult sensation. Bootleg copies spread across Europe under different titles. Behind the scenes, Thorne portrayed Ilsa with unnerving seriousness, turning what could have been parody into nightmare. The director claimed the intention was to show how fascism corrupts humanity itself, but the imagery overwhelmed the message. In later years, sequels appeared set in other fictional regimes, yet none matched the original's notoriety. Today, the movie stands as a dark reminder of how the 70s tested boundaries for shock value. It remains one of the most banned exploitation films of all time, and a symbol of cinema's dangerous fascination with power and cruelty. Number 8. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. In the grindhouses of New York City, whispers spread about a film so grotesque that even seasoned horror fans walked out. That film was Blood-Sucking Freaks, directed by Joel M. Reed. It was advertised as a E-Way horror comedy, but audiences quickly realized there was nothing funny about it. The story takes place in a macabre theater, where a sadistic showman named Sardu performs acts of torture for wealthy patrons. The twist is that his show is not illusion. Each performance is real. The movie satirized both the art world and the appetite for spectacle, but its extremity overshadowed its message. When it reached theaters in 1976, it was met with mass outrage. Feminist groups protested. Newspapers demanded it be banned. The MPAA initially refused to rate it. When it was finally released under a different title, it was pulled from theaters within weeks. Behind the camera, Reed faced condemnation, but defended the film as dark satire. The actors endured hostile reactions from the public, who thought the movie glorified cruelty. Censors banned it in the United Kingdom and many American cities. Over time, Blood-Sucking Freaks became infamous for its audacity. Its shocking scenes were quoted by filmmakers like Eli Roth as symbols of transgressive cinema. For decades, it remained underground, only resurfacing on home video with warning labels. The film's notoriety lies not in its violence, but in its reflection of how easily audiences confuse art with exploitation. Number 7. Fight for Your Life, 1977. In an era when social tensions ran high, Fight for Your Life was the match that ignited fury. Directed by Robert Endelson, this low-budget thriller was banned in Britain for over 30 years. It was condemned by critics yet revered by those who saw its brutal honesty. The story follows a violent home invasion by 3 escaped convicts who terrorize a religious African-American family. What begins as racial humiliation evolves into a confrontation of faith and revenge. The performances were raw, the dialogue merciless. It was not polished Hollywood fear. It was street rage captured on film. When released in America, protests erupted. Activist groups accused it of promoting racial hatred. Others argued it exposed the hatred already present in society. The British Board of Film Classification refused certification, calling it inflammatory. Even the studio that distributed it later disowned it. Behind the scenes, the production was chaotic. Actors clashed over the tone. Crew members feared the film would never see daylight. Endelson claimed his goal was to confront racism head-on, but his message was lost beneath the shock. Years later, film historians rediscovered it and labeled it one of the most daring exploitation films of the decade. It reflected America's cultural wounds with brutal candor. Today, Fight for Your Life is studied not for its violence, but for its raw portrayal of class, race, and vengeance. It remains a time capsule of 70s outrage that dared to make its audience uncomfortable. Number 6. Snuff, 1976. There are movies that shock audiences, and then there are movies that ignite moral panic. Snuff belongs to the latter. Released in 1976, this infamous exploitation film was marketed as containing real murder on camera. The tagline claimed it was made in South America, where life is cheap and death is a game. That was enough to make people lose their minds. Originally, the movie was an unfinished project called The Slaughter Shot in Argentina. It sat on a shelf until producer Alan Shackleton bought it and filmed a new ending depicting what appeared to be an actual killing. He edited this ending into the original footage and renamed the film Snuff. The hoax was perfect. When Snuff hit grindhouse theaters in New York, crowds gathered outside demanding answers. Was it real? Could a film actually show death? Police investigated. Protesters blocked theaters. The FBI looked into it and concluded it was staged, but the rumor refused to die. Behind the scenes, the cast and crew distanced themselves. They said they never agreed to such marketing. Shackleton, however, laughed all the way to the bank. The scandal turned Snuff into a box office sensation, despite being banned in several countries. The movie itself is clumsy, but its legacy is legendary. It created an entire urban myth that real murders were being filmed for profit. The term snuff film entered the cultural vocabulary because of it. It was not reality, but it reflected society's darkest curiosity. Snuff remains a ghost story about the power of illusion and the price of belief. Number 5. Salon Kitty, 1976. Tinto Brass, known for his fearless approach to controversial material, created one of the most notorious films of the 70s with Salon Kitty. Based on actual events, it mixed espionage politics and decadence within the setting of a Nazi-era brothel. The result was so shocking that it was banned in multiple nations upon release. The film tells of a German officer who transforms a high-class brothel into an intelligence center for the SS. The women who work there are trained to seduce powerful men and record their secrets. The story spirals into betrayal as one woman discovers the truth and plots revenge against the regime. Censors across Europe went to war with this film. Italy seized prints. Britain banned it outright. The United States released an edited version, but critics still called it obscene. Yet behind the scandal lay a masterfully crafted critique of power corruption and surveillance. The production was enormous for an exploitation film. Lavish sets, authentic uniforms, and haunting performances gave it an unsettling realism. Tinto Brass defended the film as political art, but the controversy destroyed its reputation for years. In later decades, Salon Kitty was rediscovered by historians who saw it as a precursor to films like Cabaret and The Night Porter. It dared to expose how pleasure and control intertwine under tyranny. What once seemed sensational is now studied as subversive art. Salon Kitty reminds us that sometimes the most forbidden stories hold the sharpest truths. Number 4. The Big Bird Cage, 1972. Before it was banned in several regions, The Big Bird Cage was seen as wild pulp entertainment. Directed by Jack Hill and starring Pam Grier, this women-in-prison action movie turned rebellion into spectacle. It mixed humor, danger, and chaos in equal measure, but its audacity alarmed censors. The story follows a group of women imprisoned in a remote jungle camp run by corrupt guards and revolutionaries. When a gang of outsiders plans to liberate them, all hell breaks loose. What could have been simple adventure became a riotous statement on oppression and survival. Upon release, it faced bans in Singapore, Australia, and parts of Europe. Authorities objected to its brutality and anarchic tone. Critics dismissed it as exploitation, but audiences cheered its energy. Pam Grier emerged as an icon of cinematic power and defiance. Behind the scenes, Hill ran the production like guerrilla warfare. The cast endured real tropical storms and collapsing sets, yet their performances carried authenticity. Grier performed most of her own stunts, and her charisma electrified every frame. The Big Bird Cage evolved into a cornerstone of 70s rebellion cinema. Though marketed as exploitation, it celebrated resistance and sisterhood. Its ban only amplified its legend. Decades later, it was restored and praised for its fearless tone. The movie stands as proof that even in the grindhouse, something beautiful and defiant could emerge. Number 3. The Gestapo's Last Orgy, 1977. There were few films as infamous as The Gestapo's Last Orgy. Directed by Cesare Cannavaro, it took the grim aesthetics of Nazi exploitation and transformed them into a disturbing commentary on obedience and cruelty. From the moment it was released, it was banned almost everywhere. Italy confiscated prints, Britain blacklisted it, and the United States delayed its release for years. The film follows a young woman imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp who becomes the focus of a sadistic officer's obsession. What begins as degradation turns into a twisted power struggle between victim and captor. Beneath the horror lies a meditation on control and corruption, but few viewers could see past the violence. Censors called it perverse propaganda. Critics denounced it as the lowest point of Italian exploitation cinema. Yet those who studied it decades later saw how Cannavaro used extremity to expose the sickness of fascism itself. The film mirrored the brutality of power, disguised as desire, and forced audiences to confront how far humanity can fall when rules vanish. Behind the scenes, production was chaotic. The crew shot in abandoned buildings, once used during wartime, lending eerie authenticity. The cast was divided between fear and fascination with what they were filming. Cannavaro defended his movie as an anti-fascist statement, but its imagery doomed it to obscurity. Over time, the Gestapo's Last Orgy became one of the most heavily censored films in history. When finally restored, it shocked a new generation, yet also revealed its intelligence beneath the surface. It is a reminder that some stories must go too far to expose how far others once did. Number 2. Blood for Dracula, 1974. Paul Morrissey's Blood for Dracula, also known as Andy Warhol's Dracula, was a fever dream disguised as horror. Shot in Italy under the patronage of Warhol's art circle, it took the legend of Count Dracula and turned it into a grotesque satire of aristocracy and decay. Audiences were not ready. Censors were outraged. The plot follows a weakened count who must feed on the blood of the pure to survive. But in modern Italy, purity no longer exists. As he preys on unsuspecting victims, he becomes a decaying metaphor for the dying European elite. The movie is drenched in dark humor and surrealism, yet its brutality caught officials off guard. When released, it was banned in several European nations for excessive violence. Critics accused it of mocking religion and decency. Some theaters refused to screen it after fainting incidents during the climactic scenes. Behind the scenes, director Paul Morrissey collaborated with Udo Kier, who delivered a haunting performance as the frail, desperate vampire. Filming was spontaneous, filled with improvisation and chaos. Warhol's name drew controversy, but also curiosity. Authorities treated the film like an act of rebellion rather than entertainment. In later years, Blood for Dracula was recognized as a darkly poetic vision of cultural decay. Its ban turned it into legend. The movie fused art house irony with grindhouse excess, creating something unique. It was not simply horror, it was the death rattle of an era played through the voice of a starving vampire who could no longer find innocence to feed upon. Number 1. Mark of the Devil, 1970. Before The Exorcist. Before any supernatural blockbuster, there was Mark of the Devil. Directed by Michael Armstrong and produced in West Germany, it carried a warning label declaring it the most horrifying film ever made. Audiences received vomit bags upon entry. Many needed them. The movie portrays witch hunts in a medieval village where innocent people are tortured in the name of faith. It was not fantasy. It was history made unbearable. The realism of its instruments of torture and its relentless pacing made censors panic across the globe. Britain banned it. Australia followed. Even in the United States, certain cities refused to screen it. Critics were divided. Some called it brilliant historical allegory. Others labeled it exploitative trash. Behind the scenes, actors endured genuine discomfort during filming. Real restraints fire and cold stone floors added authenticity. Star Udo Kier said years later that he still had nightmares from certain scenes. Censorship battles followed the movie wherever it went. Religious groups protested. Governments seized reels, but audiences kept demanding it. It became a phenomenon of forbidden cinema. Today, Mark of the Devil is remembered as the purest example of 70s exploitation horror. Beneath its surface shock lies a story about how righteousness can become cruelty. It forces the viewer to question who the real monsters are. Not the witches, but those who burn them. Its legacy lives on as both a warning and a masterpiece of defiance. The 70s dared to show humanity's reflection in its ugliest form, and the world looked away in fear. These films were banned, shamed, and buried, yet they refused to die. They echo even now, asking who decides what is too much for truth. Which one of these brutal visions would you dare to watch? Like, share, and subscribe for more hidden cinema.